The classroom was silent as the teacher's voice echoed off the walls. His sharp eyes were locked on a quiet girl sitting in the last row. "If you don't learn to speak up, you'll never get anywhere in life," he said coldly. The other students exchanged glances, some smirking, others looking away uncomfortably. The girl, small and shy, lowered her head. She had always been quiet. Speaking in front of people made her nervous, and she preferred to let her work speak for itself. But the teacher saw her silence as a weakness. "You think staying invisible will help you succeed?" he scoffed. "Success belongs to those who are confident, those who make themselves heard." The words stung, but she didn't respond. No one in that classroom knew what she was about to achieve, because in just a few weeks, the same teacher who humiliated her would be watching her on national television. Speechless. Have you ever seen someone prove their doubters wrong? Share your story in the comments. Stay until the end, because one moment will change everything. The school bell rang, signaling the start of another long day. Students slowly shuffled into the classroom, chatting, laughing, and settling into their seats. The walls were lined with educational posters, and the teacher's desk was stacked with books, neatly arranged in perfect order. At the front of the room, Mr. Harrison, a strict and old-fashioned teacher in his 50s, adjusted his glasses. He was known for his no-nonsense attitude and high expectations. To him, success belonged to those who spoke up, those who demanded to be heard. He had no patience for students who were quiet, passive, or hesitant. At the back of the classroom, Emily sat quietly, flipping through the pages of her notebook. She was 16, shy, and soft-spoken. She had always been the kind of student who did her work diligently but avoided drawing attention to herself. She never raised her hand in class, never interrupted, never spoke unless she had to. Her classmates barely noticed her. She was the quiet girl, the one people forgot about. And that's exactly how she liked it. Mr. Harrison scanned the classroom as he began his lecture, his sharp gaze landing on Emily. He frowned slightly. She was always quiet, always blending into the background. He had never seen her participate, never heard her offer an opinion. To him, this was unacceptable. As he spoke about the lesson, he suddenly called out, "Emily, answer this question." Emily's head snapped up. She wasn't expecting to be singled out. Her heart pounded as all eyes turned toward her. She hesitated. Her mind knew the answer, but her voice felt stuck. The silence stretched. Mr. Harrison sighed loudly. "Typical," he muttered. "Always hiding. Always too afraid to speak." Some students chuckled. Others looked away. Emily's fingers tightened around her pen. She wasn't afraid. She just didn't see the point in forcing words when her work could speak for itself. But Mr. Harrison didn't see it that way. To him, silence meant weakness. He crossed his arms and looked directly at her. If you can't even answer a simple question in class, how do you expect to succeed in life? Emily swallowed hard. She felt the weight of his words pressing down on her, but she refused to let them break her. She lowered her gaze, returning to her notebook, but in her mind she made a decision. She wouldn't argue with him. She wouldn't prove him wrong with words. She would prove him wrong with actions. That night, while everyone else slept, Emily sat at her desk, working harder than ever, because in just a few weeks she would show him exactly who she was. The next day, Emily sat quietly in class as Mr. Harrison paced at the front, his eyes scanning the room. The lesson had barely begun when he called on her again. "Emily," he said, folding his arms, "let's try this again. Give me the answer to the question on the board." Emily glanced up, reading the problem. She knew the answer instantly. She could have answered easily, but her voice stayed trapped inside. The classroom fell silent. A few students exchanged glances, smirking. Others avoided looking at her. sensing the tension growing. Mr. Harrison sighed loudly, shaking his head. "You're wasting your potential," he said, his voice sharp. "How do you expect to succeed in the real world if you can't even speak in a classroom?" Emily felt her cheeks burn, but she remained silent. Mr. Harrison turned to the rest of the class, his voice filled with frustration. "This is exactly why participation is important. If you don't speak up, if you don't make your voice heard, you'll be invisible your whole life." More chuckles from the students. Some nodded in agreement. But Emily? She wasn't laughing. At lunch, she sat alone in the corner of the cafeteria, picking at her food. She could still hear Mr. Harrison's words ringing in her ears. Across the room, she heard whispers. "She never talks. I don't even know what her voice sounds like." No wonder Mr. Harrison got annoyed. "She acts like she's too good to participate." Emily clenched her fists under the table. It wasn't that she thought she was better than anyone. She just didn't see the need to prove herself with words. What none of them knew was that she was already preparing for something much bigger than a classroom debate. Every night, while others watched TV, scrolled through their phones, or went to sleep early, Emily was studying, practicing, and preparing. For months, she had been working towards something in secret, a national competition in creative writing. She had entered on her own, without telling anyone. Not even her parents knew, because she didn't need applause or approval. She just wanted to prove to herself what she was capable of. And deep down, a small part of her wanted to prove something to Mr. Harrison, too. Weeks passed, and Mr. Harrison continued his usual routine. He barely noticed Emily most days. To him, she was just another student who would fade into the background. But then, one morning, everything changed. The principal entered the classroom, holding a folder in her hands. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held excitement. "I have an important announcement," she said, looking around the room. Everyone quieted down. She smiled, clearing her throat. "One of our students has won first place in the National Creative Writing Competition." Whispers filled the room. Students turned to each other, murmuring. Who could it be? Even Mr. Harrison raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. The principal's next words left everyone in shock. "Congratulations, Emily." The room fell dead silent. All eyes turned to Emily, who sat still in her chair, stunned. For the first time, the entire class truly looked at her. Not as the quiet girl, not as the student who never spoke, but as someone who had just done something incredible. Mr. Harrison's face paled slightly. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but for once, he was the one speechless. Emily slowly stood up as the principal smiled warmly. "Emily will be representing our school at a national-level event, where she will give a speech about her journey as a writer." A speech. The very thing Mr. Harrison believed she was incapable of doing. And now, she was about to do it on the biggest stage of her life. The school auditorium was packed. Students, teachers, and staff filled every seat, their voices blending into an excited hum. The stage was set. A large banner overhead reading, "Celebrating Excellence, National Award winner Emily Carter." Emily stood backstage, her hands clutching the speech she had spent weeks perfecting. She had written thousands of words before, but this time, it wasn't just about the words. It was about finally being heard. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Today, she would prove to herself and to everyone else that her silence had never been a weakness. Mr. Harrison sat near the front, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He still couldn't believe it. The quiet girl from the back of his classroom, the one he had dismissed, the one he had scolded for never speaking, was now the most celebrated student in the entire school. And soon, The whole country would be watching her. As the principal took the stage and introduced Emily, polite applause filled the room. Some students clapped louder than others, genuinely impressed. But there were others, Mr. Harrison included, who were simply waiting to see if she could really do it. Would she choke? Would she freeze? Would she finally prove him right? Emily stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding in her ears. The microphone stood in front of her, the bright lights making it hard to see the faces in the audience. She took another deep breath. Then she spoke. "When I was little, I thought my words didn't matter." The room fell silent. Mr. Harrison sat up straighter. Emily continued, her voice stronger than it had ever been. "I used to believe that if I stayed quiet, I wouldn't make mistakes. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, people would notice me without needing to hear me. But I was wrong." A few students exchanged glances, recognizing the truth in her words. Mr. Harrison swallowed, his chest tightening, because suddenly he realized that this speech wasn't just about her. It was about him, too. Emily looked up, her eyes scanning the crowd. She wasn't afraid anymore. "Not long ago, someone told me that if I didn't speak up, I would never succeed. That silence meant failure." She paused, her words hanging in the air. "But today, I stand here, not because I was the loudest, not because I demanded attention, but because I let my work speak for itself." The students were completely silent, hanging on her every word. Mr. Harrison shifted in his seat, his face unreadable. She was proving him wrong in front of the entire school. Emily glanced down at her speech, then made a decision. She didn't need it. She folded the paper and set it aside. Then, with confidence, she looked back at the audience. "I've learned that success doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one who works the hardest, who refuses to give up, who keeps going even when others don't believe in them." Mr. Harrison exhaled slowly, because she was right. All this time he had assumed quiet meant weak, that silence meant incapable. But Emily had just proven that true strength isn't always loud. And he had been wrong. As Emily finished her speech, the entire auditorium erupted into applause. Students stood, clapping. Teachers nodded in approval. Some even wiped away tears. And Mr. Harrison, for the first time in his life, he clapped for her too. Because today, she wasn't just the quiet girl in the back of the classroom. She was a national champion. As the final round of applause echoed through the auditorium, Emily stepped down from the stage, her heart still racing. She had done it. The thing she feared the most, speaking in front of an audience, was now behind her. And not just any audience. Her entire school. The same students who once ignored her. The same teacher who once doubted her. She had proven them all wrong. Mr. Harrison sat frozen in his seat as students around him continued clapping. He had spent years lecturing about success, discipline, and achievement, believing that only those who spoke up and demanded attention would go far in life. But today, a quiet girl from the back of his classroom had just shattered that belief. He watched as Emily made her way down the aisle, shaking hands with the principal and a few teachers who congratulated her. She still wasn't loud, still wasn't flashy, but she didn't need to be. Because today, everyone had heard her loud and clear, and he had never been more wrong about a student in his life. As the assembly ended, students poured out of the auditorium, some chatting excitedly, others replaying parts of Emily's speech. Mr. Harrison remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the empty stage. His own words from weeks ago came back to haunt him. "If you don't learn to speak up, you'll never succeed." He had said those words to her, convinced he was right. But now he realized something. Success didn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belonged to those who worked the hardest. And Emily had just shown him how wrong he had been. Later that afternoon, Mr. Harrison walked into his classroom, his usual confidence replaced by something unfamiliar: humility. He spotted Emily sitting at her desk, quietly packing her books. Unlike her classmates, she didn't stay after assemblies to soak in the attention. She just went back to her routine as if nothing had changed. But it had. Everything had. Taking a deep breath, Mr. Harrison walked over to her desk. For the first time, he hesitated. Emily looked up, surprised. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mr. Harrison finally said the words he never thought he would say. "I was wrong about you." Emily blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "I shouldn't have judged you for being quiet," he continued, his voice softer than usual. "I thought success meant being the loudest in the room. But today, you proved that sometimes the quietest voices have the most powerful things to say." Emily studied him carefully. She could tell this wasn't easy for him. For years, he had believed in one way of thinking. But today, she had forced him to change. A small smile tugged at her lips. "I never needed your approval," she said simply, "but I appreciate your apology." Mr. Harrison nodded. "I deserved that." And with that, he walked away, a different teacher than he was before. Because today, he wasn't the one teaching a lesson. He was the one learning it. The next morning, as Emily walked through the school hallways, she noticed something different. People saw her now, not as the quiet girl, not as someone to ignore, but as someone who had done something remarkable. Students who had never spoken to her before now nodded in respect. Some even whispered, "That was amazing," as she passed. A few classmates who had once laughed when Mr. Harrison scolded her now looked guilty, avoiding her gaze. She didn't need their validation, but it was a nice change. In English class, something even more surprising happened. For the first time ever, Mr. Harrison did not call on Emily. Not to put her on the spot. Not to test her patience. Not to prove a point. Instead, when he asked a question, he simply scanned the room and waited. And then, something happened that no one expected. Emily raised her hand. The class fell into stunned silence. Mr. Harrison's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his surprise. "Yes, Emily?" he asked, his voice even. She spoke clearly, confidently, not because she had to, not because someone forced her to, but because she wanted to. And this time, Mr. Harrison listened. At the end of class, as students packed up their things, Mr. Harrison glanced toward Emily as she zipped up her bag. "Emily," he said, his voice softer than usual. She looked up. "Your writing, your speech. It was extraordinary," he admitted. "Keep going. I hope to see your name in books one day." Emily smiled, but not because she needed his approval. She smiled because she had won. Not just the competition, not just the applause. She had won something far greater, respect. And she had done it on her own terms. That afternoon, as she sat by the window in the school library, pen in hand, she stared at the blank page in her notebook. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel small. She felt heard. Because today, her voice was no longer a whisper. It was a force. And she would never be silent again. Emily's journey wasn't just about winning a competition. It was about proving that strength comes in different forms. Some people shout to be heard. Others let their actions speak for them. And sometimes, the quietest voices end up making the loudest impact. Mr. Harrison learned that lesson the hard way. He once believed that success belonged only to those who spoke the loudest. But Emily showed him, and everyone else, that true power isn't measured by how loudly you speak, but by what you say when it truly matters. She didn't fight back with anger. She didn't demand respect. She earned it. What do you think? Have you ever been underestimated or seen someone prove others wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe everyone deserves a chance to prove themselves, hit that like button and share this video. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this, because sometimes one moment can change everything. See you in the next video.